searching. What most people say just can't be found, but you always find me out.
Welcome to Following the Fire. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the wilderness. Just like Israel followed the pillar of fire and smoke, we want to take a new look at our beliefs and just follow him.
And like Israel, we get it wrong a lot, we get lost a lot, but we're doing our best to go where God leads us. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Steve.
Can't compare with what you're worth. And I had been fighting.
Today we're going to be talking a bit about how growing up in the churches of Christ impacted our faith. And to all of our friends and family out there in the churches of Christ, hopefully this will be less awkward to listen to than it was for us to record it. But no promises. Enjoy.
Been screaming. All these messages.
Oh man. So how are you doing?
Pretty good. I'm hopefully I can stay awake for this. I noticed it was really nice outside and I needed to get a bike ride in, so I took a bike ride. Half the way, like 5 miles into it, it was like completely into the wind the whole time. But nice thing is, on the way back, I just kind of sort of pedaled and was going like 20 miles an hour.
Nice.
But I realized when I got back and I took a shower, I'm like, I am really wiped out. But I'll be okay. Christy made me some coffee, so.
Yeah.
So how are you?
I'm good. I had my son had the sniffles, and it's so hard with a 6-year-old, and in the morning he doesn't want to go to school, and so if he acts sick, he knows that maybe that means he doesn't have to go to school. And a year ago he said, "Daddy, I'm sick," and I was like, "No, you're not getting in the car." And the nurse called me and said he's got a 101 fever, and he actually was sick, and I felt so bad. And then that was like a week or two before we closed down everything for COVID. So then this week he said, "Daddy, I'm not feeling good." And so I was like, "Yeah, you are, but I will measure it." So I took his temperature. He was 98.1. He had high energy. I brought him to school, and then an hour later, the school nurse called and said he's got a fever. I was like, "What?" I was wrong again. I felt bad, twice in a row, but at least I did everything I could. So, I recently realized, in general in my life, I feel like a good phrase to describe my life is from the movie Elf.
Okay. It's
a very obscure quote, but it's when the workaholic dad excuses himself from dinner, and then the kid mirrors him to try to get out of eating dinner too. So he's like, "Got a bunch of homework to go over, and I'm way behind on a bunch of stuff." That's what the kid says. But I feel like I'm way behind on a bunch of stuff, and that's been true for like 6 months.
Yeah, welcome to the rest of your life.
Yeah, I know. I was worried when I thought that. I was like, and then the release from that, I feel like, will be death. I'll be like, because next week I'm gonna do a lot of things. I do a lot of things, and next week I'm gonna be slightly more behind on slightly more things.
Baby steps,
and yeah.
At least you know what to expect for the rest of your life, so you're good.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good with that. I've just accepted it. It's all right.
So what do you have on your mind?
I kind of wanted to talk about, I felt like I was tiptoeing around last time we talked about the Church of Christ, so much so that I didn't even want to say the Church of Christ. But I feel like if I can talk about it for a little bit, then I won't feel weird about it anymore. So
okay. I feel that.
That's what's been on my mind. But I wanted to talk about it, and but I'm also trying to be careful. I'm not meaning to criticize or to talk negatively or anything like that. And something I've learned is where you grow up, or what you grow, the framework that you grow up thinking about really frames how you see the world. And so
Oh yeah.
I don't know if there's something more formative in my life than growing up in the Church of Christ. And an example, I learned, I think this is true. So I realized you can go anywhere in the world and some kind of a weather event will happen. And you will hear this sentence on Monday when you go to work. How about that weather, huh? And then they'll say, well, that's for you. And they'll insert wherever you are. They'll be like, that's Texas for you, right? That's Oklahoma. That's Florida for you. That's Colorado for you. That's Paris for you. That's Belgium in April for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you just stay in the one spot, what you think is, our weather is crazy. But if you just polled everybody, is your weather crazy? They'd be like, yeah, sure is. Because weather changes.
Yeah.
In fact, we don't even call it weather unless it does a different thing. Like,
Right. Like, does San Diego have weather? It's always 72 and sunny.
Yeah. So, exactly. But when it rains, they'll be like, everyone's going to be talking about it on Monday, and they'll be,
right.
What they'll be saying is like, oh man, that California weather. And so, I'm trying to be cognizant of the fact that I grew up in the Church of Christ. And so when I think about Christianity, or when I think about churches or Christians, I'm thinking about 0.08% of people who identify as Christians, but kind of taking that to represent the whole of everything.
Yeah.
And then the second psychology thing is you will either defend something or criticize that same exact thing depending on who you're with. So, and mostly it's if you're an insider and you're with another insider, you're going to criticize the thing. But if you're an insider and now you're talking to an outsider, you're going to defend the thing. And so, I felt, I feel that way about America. If it's easy to be like, oh man, America, if you're talking to American, you might say one thing, but then if you're in France and someone says America is stupid and I think you are all ignorant of us, I'll be like, hey, wait a minute now, we do a lot of things great, and then I'll start listing the things that we do better than French people, which is meat, beer, coffee. What else? Well, there's lots of things that we do that hit home because it's food and French people. Guns and God. We got a lot more of all that stuff.
Yeah, because it's like you're defending your tribe at that moment,
Exactly. That's exactly right. But when you're at the family reunion, you make fun of your family.
Right. Because we want to make things better, right? That's why we complain, right?
That's hopefully why, I might be wrong about this, and we work for competing companies kind of, so it's always iffy. But when I'm with my company people, all I talk about is how horrible the company is. Like, I can't believe we make money. I can't believe this thing is still running, and look at all these problems. But as soon as I'm, if I was a salesperson,
oh yeah,
and now I'm talking to people using our equipment, I would be right in saying like, hey, this is great stuff. It's a good team to work for.
Yeah. And both sides are true, right?
And they are both completely true.
It's just the perspective.
It's just the perspective. So, so I feel, if I'm talking to people who grew up in the Church of Christ, we'll have the same things we love, but then we'll have things that we criticize. But then all of a sudden, if I'm talking to someone else and they're curious, I'll have a completely different list of stuff to say. So there's no adjective for when you're in the Church of Christ, maybe Church of Christer. So it's hard to talk about. But if someone asks, and then there's no global structure, there's not a pope, there's not a convention.
Yeah.
There's not an association that meets and says, this is what a Church of Christ is, and this is what a Church of Christ isn't. And so even talking about the Church of Christ is impossible because each congregation is going to be so different because they're autonomous, they're leading themselves, and so anytime you talk about the Church of Christ, I guess this is true of any other denomination or even religion, you're going to be generalizing. But the Church of Christ is a pretty American thing. Came out of the Restoration movement in the 1800s ish. Restoration meaning instead of kind of slowly, iteratively improving some denomination that was going, you just start over. It's like restoring a house. You go back to the studs. Yeah,
like people hear the Reformation a lot, which is what Martin Luther kicked off in Germany with reform. The idea was the concept was that the Catholic Church was the church, and period. And it kind of was at the time, and they wanted to he wanted to reform things. He didn't want to burn down the Catholic Church or start something new. He wanted to reform it and make it like it should be, with like the 99 Theses and all that stuff. But right. Yeah, the Restoration movement was all about the church started in 33 AD when Jesus rose from the dead, etc. So let's start there instead of starting with Martin Luther. Let's start over.
Exactly. Yep. Which is, I've been steeped in it for 30 years, but I love that. I love that idea of let's just get back to Jesus and the beginning and measure ourselves against that and move forward and make sure that that's our kind of our yardstick. And so to the Church of Christ, the loose thing that all the churches of Christ maybe have in common, or that they would describe themselves as, would be trying to base everything they do on something in the Bible.
Yeah.
Which feeds a lot of things like kind of a rejection of a creed being something that someone else wrote to kind of summarize succinctly something that's in the Bible.
Even like the Apostles' Creed, which is so popular in even a lot of evangelical churches these days, would be something that generally churches of Christ would say, no, we don't need that we got the Bible.
Yep. No creed but the Bible, which of course is a creed, but people don't say that in a Church of Christ. They don't even say no creed but the Bible. They just skipped over that. So for me, I've visited other churches, and in Paris I went to something that was maybe an Anglican church, and man, I tripped over myself because there's a creed that they said that everyone knew and I didn't, and then there was another section where I had no clue what was going on. So pretty ignorant to a lot of what other churches are doing. Biblical names for biblical things. Immersion baptism, full dumpage as an adult.
Yeah.
And then I would say, adding on to that, if there's nothing in the Bible about what to do, then trying to look at what did they do in the first century.
Right.
But what if you were a Christian if you were 99.92% of Christians and you went to a Church of Christ, first thing you would notice is that we don't worship with instruments.
Right.
And then what we would hope you notice is that we're really strong in biblical knowledge.
Yeah.
I would say that. But the instrument thing is a huge deal.
Yeah.
And then I'd say after that, kind of on accident, the thing that is not part of what a Church of Christ is trying to be, but what it accidentally is when you do want to go back to the basics, it still had I would call it a modern meaning just logical thought approach to what is Scripture, and an emphasis on actually Sunday, the worship, doing that part right, which means that we as a tradition have tried to read the Bible to find clues for what are those things.
Mm-hmm.
What are those rules, so that we know that we're doing it right, which is, if it's 3 generations from the person who was well-intentioned, then what you just know is, well, we don't do all this stuff and we think the right stuff. So we're correct. So some good things about the Church of Christ, I would say, are a strong emphasis on biblical study, really, really beautiful worship, because everyone has to sing, and it's just really powerful when
4-part harmony, a cappella.
And so we've gotten good at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So songs where we're singing complex melodies and harmonies. What else? I really love, there's not a clergy, so everything is layperson led. There still may be professional or paid ministers or staff, but I'd say, if you went to 100 churches of Christ, you would see 90 people standing up in front of the congregation doing something, and they're not being paid to do it. They're just people, regular people.
Yeah.
Really like that. Local autonomy is pretty cool too, because regular people like us can have influence or talk about, what we think should be important. And then things that are scary is when you really emphasize believing the correct thing, and that'll accidentally be tied to salvation eventually. If you believe the right thing, then that makes you saved, which means the stakes are incredibly high.
For almost anything.
For almost anything. And so that has, for one, that makes it very hard to talk about things that we're not sure about, or even say we're not sure about something. Because there's introducing that insecurity might be like, what about my salvation?
Yeah, or if something I believed one way is maybe different than I thought, is everything a sham?
Right. Yeah. And the other unintended effect of wanting to believe all the right things and then accidentally tying that to salvation, unspokenly, is it's really hard to make friends as a congregation with the other congregations in the town.
Right.
And I would say that's actually something that is very hard to notice, because it's a thing that is absent. But if you were in a different church, you would, and then you went to a Church of Christ, you would realize, like, oh, our pastors don't meet with the other pastors every week for breakfast, or we don't call them pastors either,
right,
but our
ministers.
Yeah, and even, things that have been controversial even at our church are things like, hey, we want to help with this fire thing, and the Baptists are doing something. We can't join them in that effort because that would be controversial, even though what we're doing is giving people water bottles out of a trailer. So we've got to do our own thing. So it's kind of made it a very isolated thing from other traditions. And so I'm just barely learning about, like, hey, who else is out there? What are you doing Monday through Saturday?
Yeah,
that's different from what I do Monday through Saturday, and also, what are you doing on Sunday?
The rain is falling hard on this dusty ground. And I got no way of knowing what will grow.
So that's a weird, that's kind of an intro in case there's anyone that hasn't heard of the Church of Christ or didn't grow up in it. I skipped a lot.
That's fine.
There's a lot more, but tell me about kind of your journey and your relationship with the Church of Christ.
So obviously I've been going to the Church of Christ, or a Church of Christ of some sort, since I was born. My parents and all my extended family and my grandparents on I think my grandparents on my dad's side were converted in Nebraska, maybe before my dad was born, or roughly around that time. And then my family on my mom's side goes back, I don't know how long, with Churches of Christ connections, and generally, well, actually, I did some. I got a while back. I got really into Ancestry.com.
Okay, yeah,
and then I traced back, and there were lots of generations of preachers of some sort or the other, and then there's kind of a gap of like farmers or bankers or something. And then I got into all these several generations of like Baptist ministers, and then like the earliest members of my family that came over from England, like in the 1600s or something, helped build the first Church of England.
Oh, wow.
Cathedral or something in like Virginia or something. So church has been part of my family forever.
Right.
But heavily, quote unquote, Church of Christ for as long as is practically, practically historical for my family.
Yeah. Family history.
Yeah.
Which is, you can only remember family memory. That's what I mean to say.
That's probably a better way to put it. 'Cause, yeah, you can only remember a few generations back,
Yeah.
and then
Three
it kind of becomes
max,
like,
and then
right. It just kind of becomes like noise at that point. But my grandpa on my mom's side was he was a preacher. His dream was to plant churches around the country, and I grew up thinking that was the only way to go. And the terminology used in Churches of Christ, for better or worse, is often a exclusivistic type of, is that a word? Exclusivistic?
I'll take it. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Let's go with it. Exclusivistic terminology as far as like, we are the church, and
there's a weird Church of Christ moment that happens all the time, which is that you'll be talking to someone, a deep COCer, and they'll say the church, and then suddenly you've got to read them to figure out, wait a minute, do you mean, so it intersewed in many congregations that I've been to, but certainly my home congregation, are people who strongly believe that, and when they use the word the church, they mean people who are members of Churches of Christ. And if you're not in the church, then you're not a Christian. And not in the Church of Christ, then you're not a Christian.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's an important point, because I think the reason a lot of the attitude in Churches of Christ are like, we're the only ones going to heaven type of thing.
Yeah.
Is, and that's not, I think if you talk to most Church of Christers, we need a better term. They would say, well, we know we're not the only ones going to heaven.
Yeah.
There are a lot of other Christians out there that we just don't know about them.
Yeah. Well, but
the implication
also,
being that there may be a couple like hidden in the Catholic Church here and there, or
sure,
in the mega church down the road. But
I think there's a spectrum. I think there's plenty of people in the Church of Christ who have a non-exclusionary, non-exclusive view, and they're like, oh yeah, but I would say, so the spectrum in a congregation is going to be from very exclusive to not.
Yes.
But I think it'd be very common in any Church of Christ congregation to at least have a population of people that is like, yeah, we're the only ones.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make. That there's always a spectrum. There's always, saying that, like you even pointed out when you started out kind of describing it, Churches of Christ are not technically homogenous. They're not always the same. And there while there is no central authority, quote unquote, if someone says I go to a Church of Christ, what the check boxes are.
Yeah.
Like no instruments, no women doing anything, Lord's Supper every week. There are elders. The preacher is not the pastor; he's a preacher.
Yeah. Because
pastor is a word for elder, and we have elders, and they run things, and set down all down the list that you just said, and so there's a huge gamut of beliefs and opinion among those things. Often the central point being brought back to baptism a lot of times, as far as baptism being the moment at which you are saved. And it's got to be full water baptism, because that's what baptism means. It means immersion. It doesn't mean anything having to do with water. And
Right. Yeah.
and I remember, so, like with my whole history being Church of Christ, and like I mentioned last time, I've never been to I've never been to a worship service on a Sunday. I should clarify, at not a Church of Christ. I think we stumbled into a mass once in a while in Vienna or something. But having come from that perspective, and that's all I ever knew, there are a lot of things that you pick up accidentally. Like my parents never sat me down and said, "Okay, Stephen," because I'm Stephen to my parents, by the way, not Steve. They're like, okay, they never said, "Okay, Stephen, if you want to go to heaven, you have to go to a place with a sign that says Church of Christ on the wall, on the outside, and small c for church, and etc." But that's the vibe I got from the world around me growing up, the faith world around me. And so I always felt that everybody else is trying, but we've figured it out, and, there's probably so many caveats. We could just keep going all day with caveats, but people in Churches of Christ are trying just as much as everybody else is trying, I think.
Yeah.
It's like, exactly. I don't think people in the Methodist Church are like going, screw the Bible. I'm going to do what I want to do.
You know what? We're good with a C here.
Right.
Exactly. Those overachievers over at the Church of Christ.
Right. We don't want to be that good.
Yeah.
I think, and that's something that over time I kind of had to learn, because I kind of have formed by no direct teaching. I formed this idea that we're the right ones. Everybody else was really screwing up and really making mistakes, and they probably didn't care because they were being influenced by Satan or who knows what. And I remember I went to Oklahoma Christian University when I was after high school, and I was I majored in Bible. So one of my early preacher classes was the history of the church, the history of the Restoration movement. Basically, was the title of the church of the class. And one of the assignments was to find a church in town and interview the pastor, the leader, the preacher, whatever they called themselves. But it had to be a church that was not from our faith tradition, not from our group, which included, if you go back to the Restoration Movement information, it included like Disciples of Christ,
Christian churches,
Christian Church, and a couple other edge fringe churches. And I'm like, okay, and I didn't catch that part of the assignment, so I actually ended up going to the Disciples of Christ Church in Edmond, Oklahoma.
And did it have a woman pastor?
No.
Okay.
I'm not sure I would have talked to a woman pastor at that point. But I remember I set up an interview with this guy, and I recorded the audio so I'd have it to write down stuff. And I remember talking to him, and I was shocked at some of the things that they believed. And I thought, holy cow, these guys are off the rails. Because the guy, like, he's like, don't tell anybody, but I baptized my kids when they were born. But I was surprised that they had elders, and I was surprised that they baptized full immersion and a lot of things. And so it was weird, but I kind of got chided for going to the wrong church, but the guy's like, okay, but this guy's off the rails enough that you still get an A. But it's little things like that, and that I started realizing that there are other people who are trying to do this too, and that we're not the ones who we don't have cornered the market, I guess.
We don't have a monopoly on not just on Jesus, but on earnestly seeking to live out what God wants us to do.
Right. And even to the point where the did mission work in Germany to establish a Church of Christ, a Gemeinde Christi in Dresden.
Gemeinde, yeah.
And what is it in Dutch?
I think the same, Gemeene van Christus.
Okay.
It means community, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Anyway, and people would ask us when we were over there, like, "What? Don't we already have churches in town?" I'm like, "Yeah, but anyways, we even to the point where we came back to the States, and I remember I was driving around town after we'd been here back. It's probably, we came back in 2009. I think I was driving around probably 2011, 2010, driving to work, and I saw this sign for this church in town called Vintage Church. I was like, "What is that? Like, what do they like have like plastic couches?
Wine and Jesus."
Like vintage, I think like 1950s.
Oh yeah.
Anyway,
retro church.
Right, retro church. Thank you. So I looked them up online, and I was shocked, like legitimately shocked, that they baptized people, full immersion, and like the whole. I'm like, what? And here I am, like, I'm like 35 years old, and I'm just realizing that, like, even more, that we don't have a corner on the market. We don't have the monopoly.
It's interesting that you're so. I never had that experience of, oh, other Christians are doing this thing too. Probably because I had a childhood friend who was an Eastern or Greek Orthodox Christian, and then I don't know why, but I wasn't surprised that other people had one element or another.
Mm-hmm.
But I spent all my Sundays growing up going to churches of Christ, and so I knew what the things were that we did, but they were a different set of things that were important, and they were because they were the things that I knew were contrasting to other churches.
Is it love for me or resentment for the words that I spoke? But the sky is pouring down, so either way, we'll know.
That's really interesting what you just said about the things you felt were important. And
Yes.
I'm curious, what were those things that you felt were important as far as church goes?
So I would say what you said about what you were accidentally taught but never explicitly told.
Yeah.
That has been something I've tried to think so much about because of what I was accidentally taught about sex, but never told, that I wish that I had that had been different. The things that I was accidentally taught about lots of things, and as a result, I'm trying to look at what am I accidentally teaching my son, and what.
Oh.
So I know what I'm wanting to teach, but what do my actions and what I make important? What am I teaching my son is actually important. So as a kid, my as far as family memory goes, all Church of Christ. My grandma converted, and I used to think that meant she was not a Christian before, but she was.
Mm.
She was just a different kind of Christian. Same thing. We have. I remember a leader of the church had for years and years and years talked about when he became a Christian, and I realized that as an adult, having known him my whole life, that he had been a different kind of Christian before.
Mm.
He wasn't an atheist or a non-believer. He was a Catholic, and so that blew my mind, because I think I did growing up think Christian is a broader term than just Church of Christ, and that there are people that do all kinds of things, including baptize the same or differently than we do. But no one ever said anything. But I came to really strongly believe that instrumental worship was a problem. Mm. And I believed it. So I had a really close childhood friend who I don't know why. I was too young to know why, but their family left our church for another church. And I took it extremely personally. I was like 8.
Wow.
So as a no, that's wrong. I was in 4th or 5th grade or something, but I knew what was different about the church he went to was that they had instruments, and that must be wrong. And so I said lots of things like, I damaged our relationship over that issue. And we, it probably still isn't, he probably still thinks I feel that way. I damaged another relationship 10 years after that because the guy did think that instrumental worship was wrong. Right. So I get it wrong. No matter what I believe, I'm still very capable of getting what is important wrong. But that was a formative memory for me. And then when I went to college at a Church of Christ school, I some of my early friends that I met were the art kids, and the art kids went to Bridgeway, which in my mind was this super liberal church, where crazy things happen. And I walked in and I felt a gut reaction to what was happening in there. And I'm thankful for that experience, because my gut reaction was that there was instrumental worship, and it felt so wrong, and I felt so convinced, because a gut reaction skips your brain. That's how strong it is. And that's how fast it is. And it comes from the things that are deep within you. And I'm thankful to have, so things that I've gut reacted to are people who open presents before Christmas, especially before it's even Christmas Eve, but Christmas Eve counts as like, wait, what is happening here? And instrumental worship. And it's helpful to know I've hold those two things equally true and equally important, and they're more important than anything that I could logically convey to you. And I like to think about that a lot, because I feel like the word for gut in the Old Testament was gut, but we translate it heart a lot of the time, and we say, watch out for your heart. Your heart is deceptive. But we're like, oh, when you read a verse that's like, your heart is deceptive, we don't quite connect it to, you will see things sometimes and be so convinced that they are wrong that you won't even think about it, right?
Wow.
That's how segregation was to people in the South.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't that it was a gut reaction to the way things have always been. We would have that reaction if our church said, hey, we're remodeling and we realized we'd save a lot of money if we just combined the men and women's bathrooms into one bathroom. We'd be like, what?
Yeah.
Would it be fine? Yeah. The bathrooms in my home are not segregated by gender, and we figure it out. When there's a line of porta potties next to each other, if there's a man in one and a woman next to the other, we're not worried about that. And you could certainly go to another culture and they'd be like, what's the big deal? It's a completely cultural construct that we have that feels so wrong, so wrong, that I couldn't get past that sentence before people would be like, I'm leaving this church. You are mixing the genders together. It's like, first of all, it's a good thought exercise to go through. Like, what's a gut reaction like? And it's when things are, when it's not the way you grew up, and you have the same thing to getting married and going to someone else's home for the way that they serve dinner.
Yeah.
So I had that reaction to instrumental worship. I'm blessed. My grandpa was a Church of Christ preacher, but he was a geologist, which is helpful because a geologist has some beliefs about the world that can be different from, let's say, if you just went to seminary. You could probably find a Church of Christ out there where the preacher is a young earther or certain kinds of creationists. And my grandpa thought that we were, as a tradition, doing a disservice to ourselves by trying to argue things that, as a scientist, that he knew were clearly false. And so I had a strong. Okay, one more anecdote. In high school, maybe I don't know, junior year of high school, I wrote a young Earth paper though.
Really?
Using my source was answersingenesis.com. And for the whole year I was fighting with my teacher about Christianity, but also a very literal, I didn't want, in that setting, as an insider talking to an outsider, I didn't want to let go of one little thing to show a chink in the armor. And so, who knows what kind of cringy stuff I wrote in that, 10-page paper. So what I thought was important were the things that I had grown up with and that were what distinguished me from the outside.
Please don't turn away. Please don't hide your face.
As you're talking, I was thinking about the distinctions that we make from other groups, and thinking back to the history of things like that. It's kind of what the Restoration movement was sort of based on, is like, we are not like these people. And like, well, we've got all these churches around me already. It's like, because it started around 1800. And it's like, well, yeah. What are you? It's like, are you Catholic? No, we're not Catholic. Well, why not? Because we don't do these things. We're not Methodist because we don't do these things, Baptist, etc. And that kind of became, I think, an accidental, like kind of a tradition in Churches of Christ, where they spent, especially in like the 50s and the 60s, they spent a lot of time on sermons about how Methodists are wrong or the Catholics are wrong or whatever. I even remember in one of my classes in college, one of my favorite professors at the time, Kurt Nickham, it was a Romans class, and he said, and I'll never forget this, he's like, if we define ourselves as not like other churches, we will define ourselves out of existence.
That's a good one.
Because so much of I inferred so much about that growing up that what is important is to not be like them in these ways.
Right. And that framework, it seeps in. It's hard to not, and I think it's at its root is the thing that we started with, which was kind of a desire to be correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
And humans, we're always defining ourselves by who we are and who we are not. But I think especially in the Church of Christ, that has crept in so much so that I've even been in towns where the Church of Christ population is significantly higher, which would be the Bible Belt. Kentucky is like that. So when there's more than one Church of Christ in the town, or more than 5 churches of Christ, they stop defining themselves by how they're different from Catholics or Presbyterians. Now they're talking about how they're different from the other churches of Christ in town. And, if there were 100, then we'd find names for them so that we could just find, the one to my left and my right, here's how we're different from them. And so that I heard this term, which was like, this guy derogatorily talking about another Church of Christ in his town said they're an anti-church. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh, what's an anti-church? He was like, they're known by what they're against. They're just against a lot of things. And I was like, oh man. And it's so important to know what you're for and form your identity about what you're for, or you will by default define yourselves by what you're not or what you're against.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly where I've kind of come in my faith journey through my life, is growing up in a tradition where I got the vibe that it was all about what you're not. And obviously we talked about what to do, but there's a lot of emphasis on, well, we don't do this, we don't do that, we don't do this and that. And I'm getting closer to the point of trying to be inclusive, maybe is not the right word, but try to figure out what commonalities do we have amongst people who are quote unquote Christian in the world. instead of focusing so much on how they don't do like that 1 hour a week on Sunday morning the right way. Okay, so maybe they don't do things the way that I've grown up doing them. They have a woman preaching, or they've got instruments, heaven forbid, or whatever. What are they? What is this church about? What are these people like? Are they following God?
Are they followers?
Yeah. Are they just believers like we talked about last time, or are they actually followers? Are they disciples? Are they changing the world? Are they? I mean, all these things, and I'm trying to see other churches and other Christians as what are we about together? And I always go back to that story in the Gospels about how the apostles come back to Jesus. They're like, somebody's prophesying and doing miracles in your name. What are we going to do? We got to stop them. He's like, hold on. If they're doing it in my name, let them do it.
Yeah, so I thought George Bush famously misquoted that verse.
Oh yeah,
and he accidentally said something like, "If you're not with us, then you're against us," right? So George Bush, if you're not with us, you're against us, George Bush. But what Jesus said was, if you're not against us, you're with us.
Right.
It's like, what? What do you mean, Jesus?
Yeah.
And the second scary verse is, by the measure that you use, you will be measured, or the way that you judge people is how you're going to be judged. And that doesn't necessarily have to be talking about salvation, but man, what a scary verse. If I look at my life, because I have taken these things, this way of thinking about faith, which is, even now I would say that our home congregation is pretty open.
Yeah.
But it's still very common in a class or a sermon to hear, here's a wrong theology as a straw man or it could be a real argument, but here's the wrong way to see this. Now let me tell you the right way to see this. It's so hard for me to not take that with me, and see the spongy bread, or see the, or something in a song, some lyric, or I want to do church the right way so bad that I get distracted by these things that are on the outside of what does it mean to be a Christian, and I miss the core so often. And it was a wake-up call for me. The Pharisees were doing that. The Pharisees really wanted to be correct, earnestly wanted to be correct. And what they did so that they could make sure that they were being correct is first they codified, they went through the Bible, their scripture, their Torah, and then their other teachings, and they said, here it is. And then they said, well, what does that mean? Because some of these are a little vague. And so they added to that to make sure, okay, well, here's what it means, or here, let's draw a barrier around it that's even wider than that law, so that we can be sure that we're not breaking a law. That's out of an earnest desire to be correct. But what God says is like, yeah, but it's not sacrifice that I desire, it's mercy. Or what Jesus said was, you are straining gnats, but you're swallowing a camel. You are trying so hard and you want so bad to be correct that in doing so, you have missed the whole point. The whole point. And so I definitely missed in straining gnats and getting good at using the Bible as a gnat strainer. I just missed so many camels. And if you take a hair sample, it's going to be like 60% camel that I have swallowed and has become a part of me. And I have missed, the first two commandments. I think part of the reason is if you read the Bible as, one, your debate book for winning debates against other Christian denominations, but also just two, if you think the Bible's got rules for how to do worship correct, then you're going to end up with the Church of Christ. that's how you get to the Church of Christ. Is you say the Bible is how to do worship correct. Now go. Now find it. Like, okay, that what will spit out from that is the Church of Christ, but maybe the Bible isn't that. Maybe the Bible is, here's who God is and here's who you are.
Yeah, and to be fair, Churches of Christ are not the only or the first groups to approach it that way. You know, I was this morning. I was lying in bed thinking about. My mind goes weird places, but I was thinking about the hermeneutic that we tend to use. Hermeneutics being like how you like the set of rules and guidelines that you use to interpret the Bible, and how even in growing up and in college, the term was command, example, necessary inference, and
nice.
The command is like, is it commanded directly? Okay, you got to do that thing, or not do that thing. Is there an example of that thing? If there is, and you have to do that or not, accordingly. And necessary inference being, is there something inferred in Scripture that seems to imply that you should do or not do a thing? And I was talking to my wife about it, and she's like, I've never heard that in my life. When I described it, she's like, oh yeah, that's how I grew up too. And like the necessary inference thing would, like the non-instruments in church, like no instruments thing, comes from Scripture where Paul says, sing and make music in your hearts to God. Well, that basically says sing. It doesn't say and play instruments. It says sing and make music in your hearts. So I guess you're supposed to play the guitar in your heart and not out like in real life. Right. And how I totally get where that comes in. And I mean, there's more to it than that. I mean, that's a simplistic explanation, but when you read Scripture that way, to me, the example and necessary inference are very easily just two more fences, just like the Pharisees put up. And sometimes even the command stuff, because we're looking at it as white Americans, and that's how we do things.
We're looking at it as rational, individualistic. We've got all these things built into it, Western. And so when we read, especially, I've thought about this before, like, and as a kid, you'll run into verses where you're like, this is literally talking about what to do in worship, and we don't do this thing.
Yeah.
So like, women should cover their heads when they pray. It's like, we just covered that by just not letting them pray, but
or that one's cultural.
Yeah. So exactly. So we said some things are cultural, but it was always hard for me to understand, which things are and which things aren't, because there's so much instrumental worship in the Bible, right? So that's kind of a hard thing to convey. But I think what I've been trying to focus on, and what I think Jesus tried to say over and over and over, was there are some things that are more important than other things. And I like to say this is more than that. And there are so many times in the Bible when there are good things, but then there's a better thing.
Yeah.
And so if you think, the Bible is, first of all, if you think the Bible is the rules for worship, the Bible did a poor job.
Yeah.
It'd be nice if it was, because if the Bible was the rules for worship, it probably could have been a lot shorter, and it'd be like, start here, do this, 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 and this. You can have this many songs from this source. This kind of person can do this thing. The end. It'd be one, 200 pages.
Yeah, we're completely lacking in order of worship.
Order of worship, or
Bible.
contents of worship, or day of worship, or there are examples here or there, but it's like reading a spy novel, and it's like, this is how to shoot a target. Like, maybe the guy uses a gun, but it's if that's all you do is read the spy novel, and it's like, then he casually took it out, and you think that that's rules on how to shoot a target, you not only are you mistaking, what's the story here that is trying to convey, but you're going to learn how to shoot a target in a weird way too. And it's hard to work myself out of that though, because I have spent so much time reading the Bible in a way that mostly talks about my Sunday mornings, that it's hard for me to stop doing it. But Jesus, and the prophets were trying to say, like, you've gotten a lot of, talking about the Sabbath or talking about some tricky question that the Pharisees asked him. A lot of the time he just answered them like, you're missing the point. That question, I can't even answer that question.
It's the wrong question.
It just misses the point. It's the wrong question. Let me tell you this. Like, sure, you said love God, and then you said love your neighbor. I want to be like, but who's my neighbor? He's like, okay, here's who's your neighbor. The Samaritan, the one that got it all wrong. They think God looks like a cow. They worship in the wrong town. That's who's your neighbor. You're so busy trying to focus on what is the exact right thing that you're missing.
Absolutely.
What I'm trying
and
to say.
I think that it's so the more important thing is so important. And I think that, and to be fair, any person who goes to a Church of Christ or grew up in Church of Christ knows, or would say, they would say the Bible's not all about Sunday morning. I mean, it's about living your life, salvation, things like that. But the interesting thing about it is, for 99% of the time, what defines the Church of Christ is that Sunday morning time. It's not like everything else is pretty much common, like help the poor, love your neighbor, all these things that Jesus says clearly. We all want to do the same thing generally in the world, in our lives. But we've decided that Sunday morning is the time that's going to make me right or wrong across the board. And I think that that's in my life, that's something I've slowly over time, through the many, many examples or experiences that I've had, has gotten me to the point where I'm realizing, I think the amount of things that I feel are vital and important is shrinking and becoming more distilled.
Would you remember the sunny days we shared? And all the laughter and joy before the rain.
I guess what sums it up is, churches of Christ don't have the monopoly. And once again, it's not that churches of Christ are wrong. It's that I think that the emphasis has been on the difference for so long, and on some things that I think that people need to take a new look at. And we need to be focusing more, like Jesus said, like, who is for us and who can we partner with and what can we do together, instead of just trying to be divisive. And there are even, I'm sure that there are leaders in churches of Christ all over the world that do things like that. Like our preacher here in town, he goes to the prayer breakfasts with, other pastors and things like that. So it's not like, I once again, I don't want to lump everybody together.
Painting with extremely broad brushes.
What I'm talking about is myself and my experience and my journey, because I was so hardcore, only Church of Christers are going to heaven. And in my personal journey, I have really gotten to the point where I don't believe that. I think that followers of Christ are going to go to heaven, and you can get a whole debate about what that means. But I think that we need to be more open and welcoming to other people who love Jesus, and want to follow God through the wilderness. And I think that we'd have a lot more. I think that's the unity that Jesus was wanting. He's praying for in the garden. It's not
Yep.
It's not unity that we all go to the same church building.
Or do things the same way, or care about the same things, or like the same songs. None of that, in my opinion, is required for unity.
Yeah, it goes all the way back to before I moved to Germany, I had a guy at a congregation approach me after I give us like a sermon, kind of like a fundraising type thing. And he approached me afterwards. He's like, "So what version of the Bible do they use over in Germany? Is it the King James?" I'm like,
better be.
I'm pretty sure they have some German translations. And it, like, the look on his face was like, what?
Right.
You know, do people do things differently in a different country? If they're a different language even?
Because I've built, you know, my identity on that King James is better than something else, because I defined myself as the contrast from the next church over. But then when I take a step back and realize, like, the King James is just the English, you know, Jesus wasn't speaking King James's English. Yeah. He was talking in Aramaic and quoting, you know, the Greek Bible and the Hebrew Bible. You know, I'm, you know, in all of, I could probably criticize specific churches of Christ or the Church of Christ for days, and that's actually a fault that I have inherited from growing up, thinking what matters is thinking and doing and saying the right things in churches, and defining ourselves by what we as a body believe or don't believe, and even that is wrongheaded. But I have no desire to like leave the Church of Christ in order to find some group that's done it better or doing it better.
Right.
It's not at all. And I'm, you know, in all of that criticism, I want to be clear that my perspective changes have mostly come from me doing it wrong lots and lots of ways, including, you know, chastising my friend for worshiping at a instrumental worship church, and then 10 years later criticizing my friend who thought that it was wrong to use instruments. Both of those I did wrong. And neither of, you know, it's, and when Paul talks about, you know, eat meat or don't eat meat, he's talking about that thing that I get wrong, which is like, yeah, so maybe somebody's technically right there. I think somebody is technically right there, but there's something more important even than being technically right. And so I do want to come to this humbly, because not only have I gotten it wrong so many times, but I still get it wrong. And not just, you know, I've started to have humility, not just like, who do I think is in or out, but you know, I even have humility now when I talk to non-believers, because I need Jesus more than they do. I need Jesus, like sick people need a hospital, and Jesus, me needing Jesus doesn't make me better than you.
Right.
You know, it is an acknowledgement that I don't got it figured out. And the modern logical Bible reading part of me wants to be right about things and then stop there and then try to correct people when I see that they're wrong. But the part of me that is being changed and shaped by Jesus, and the part of me that's trying to have a relationship with Jesus is working on me to see the places where I'm wrong, and to have a lot of grace for the people around me that are at different places and in different aspects of their life.
I think that the immediate assumption when, as I've talked to several families and individuals lately who have if they're worshiping someplace else now, and I've seen it from the inside, and hearing it from people from the outside, it was interesting that the assumption for most people, and it's still in a Church of Christ, is that you left because you think we're doing it wrong, and that these other people are doing it all right. And it feels like a judgment on them.
And that's why people take it so personally, and that's why And that's why it feels like a judgment on them. And it feels like because we've accidentally tied all these things to salvation, not explicitly, but just in our gut, not in our brain. Not only are you saying you found a better thing than us, but am I going to hell now because I'm still worshiping at a Church of Christ? No one says that out loud, but I think in the gut area, it still connects there. Like, wait a minute. If you're going there, that first of all, that means that they're doing it right. But then second of all, what does that say about my salvation? Which is not it at all.
Yeah, and I think it takes a lot of humility that to realize that, okay, if I go to this other church in town, yeah, I know that they're doing some things quote unquote wrong or whatever. I mean, I could make a list.
Wrong, yeah.
And
but are they gnats? And maybe should I?
Right, so
do I need more gnats and less camels in my diet?
Less hair for sure. But this other church,
yeah.
I could make a list of things that are wrong, but I could turn around at any church in town and do the same thing, including church that I grew up with. And so I think the humility that I think that I'm trying to find, I'm trying to work at, because it's so ingrained, like you were saying, in our minds and hearts, or our guts, is that just because I go to a place and I've always thought this one thing, regardless of what that thing or place is, that doesn't mean that it's always the right thing, or that I can't go someplace else and be just as pleasing to God. Because I think that's the goal to me is am I pleasing God? Am I following him? Am I exalting him? Or am I trying to make sure that I just do things the right way? And you could argue all day long about which is which and which leads to one and the other and all that kind of stuff. And I think that there are things that matter. Don't get me wrong. But I think exactly what you said is we need to take a new look, in my opinion, about what's a gnat and what's a camel.
Yeah, and have a little bit of grace for people who think things are camels that we think are gnats, right, and things that we think are gnats that we, and humility that maybe I should start measuring people by the measure I hope God uses for me.
Absolutely. Which
is, man, I hope I don't get nailed on the stuff that I believe wrong, because it's there. And so,
yeah, lots of grace is what we get. So lots of grace is probably what we should give.
Amen to that. It's in the Lord's Prayer. I've been trying to pray the Lord's Prayer every day.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to get to know Jesus, and I'm trying to let him give me my priorities instead of me make up my own. Because what I think is important is what I'm good at.
Yeah.
When I see someone else, I admire them for the things that are like me, which is extremely narcissistic and selfish. I like quick wit. I like people who are like have higher than average IQ. I'm already, I'm bragging about myself in that, but I value humor. I value people who don't show a lot of emotion, because that's what is easy for me. But what I should value is, anyways. But the Lord's Prayer is such a good realignment tool, because you start and say, like, God's up here, and I hope, and I want everyone to see you up here, including myself. And your will is done sometimes, but I want it to be done everywhere, including in my life. And then you go from that to like, but I need stuff every day. I need you because I'm lacking.
Yeah.
And then, by the way, I need your help to forgive the people around me that I'm holding all this stuff against. But I ask that you please forgive me for all the ways that I fall short. And so it's such a great, it puts God up here. What I've got against people are those small debts, those little things. But what I earnestly want is not to be correct, like the Pharisees were correct. It's to be incorrect. Like Peter was never right a minute of his life. So, I want to be like Peter or like David, who also never got it. David got very few things right.
Yeah.
But he was just lunging towards God. So is Peter, sometimes literally plunging, and he was just jumping towards like, I want to do this, I want to follow you, and he got it wrong almost every time. But I want to be a follower. I want to follow that fire, and in this time where I am, which is kind of a Sabbath from in-person church, when I go back, I don't want to just flip that switch back on to, here I am being a Christian, and I go to this church because of the feeling it gives me, or because I feel it's the best one. I want to be letting the Spirit work through me, and then I want to find a community that is going that direction too, that I can benefit and that they can benefit me, and hopefully that we don't accidentally teach my kid the wrong thing on accident.
And I want to be defined by who I'm going toward, not who I'm trying to avoid.
Yeah.
Or what I'm against. And I think that's what we're both trying to figure out, is how to do that, where to do that.
I want Christians to be known by their love for real. But I feel like we live in a world where Christians are known by their judgments. Yeah. And I've got so much judgment in me about any topic, secular or religious. I will rank you as a person. If you drink Folgers coffee, then I'm, it's maybe a salvation issue for me and for
yeah, I'd agree.
So, but Jesus came and told the religious people, like, hey, start loving the people that God loves. Don't be too concerned about hanging out around people that other people are going to think you're doing the wrong thing, even.
Yeah.
So it's hard. I've gotten it wrong so many times that I don't trust myself. I don't trust my gut. And now I'm trying to see where's God leading me, and how can I be following and doing Monday through Saturday.
Yeah.
And not just thinking and believing the right things.
Amen. All right, want to wrap this up?
Let's wrap it up. Yeah.
Go watch the Super Bowl.
Go watch the Super Bowl. What's left of it? I've got we have married into our family a sports ball fan, someone who really takes it seriously. And
oh yeah,
speaking of salvation issues, like not only was I a nerd and not good at any sports, but I never cared very much because all my teams were the Colorado teams, and they're not good at anything. And so it's so hard for me to care about football. But in my job, I talk to workers every day of my life.
Yeah.
All over the nation. And so I developed this trick. So you can borrow it too, because I think you have similar views on football or any kind of sports ball. So if you're, you meet someone new, let's say it's a business transaction or a new hire or whatever, and they see that you're a male, and so what they assume is that you really like the sport that they like.
Right.
So they're going to jump right in and say, hey, how about that interception, right? So first of all, I don't know what sport they're talking about. They're assuming so many things about me that not only do I care about whatever sport this is, but that I watch that game and that I root for. So that's an example. But the answer that works 100% of the time, and that is honest, even though it's extremely deceptive, is, oh man, I don't even want to talk about it. Oh man, I don't even want to talk about it. It's true. You're lying by telling the truth. Because what you're saying is, I don't like that thing, and this conversation's going nowhere. But what they think you're saying is, I care so much about that thing.
So much more than you, even.
So much more than you that it's too soon for me to talk about it.
Oh, wow.
Probably works with politics too. We should try that. But
that's
definitely
fantastic.
Works with football. I don't even want to talk about it, man.
Well,
Respect. Sorry, man. It's rough. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Oh man, it's been good talking to you.
It's been good. Yeah, I'll see you next week.
And I had been screaming.
We're really glad you joined us for our discussion today. For show notes and contact info, please go to followingthefire.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'd also really appreciate you giving us a review wherever you happen to get your podcasts. And special thanks to Daniel Wheat for our music. You can find more of his stuff on Spotify and Apple Music. See you later.
But even on my heart can't compare with what you're worth.